I'm reading from the book The Barn by Wright Thompson. It's really two books in one. One of the books is about the lynching of Emmett Till, and the other book is really a history of the Mississippi Delta. And I'm going to be reading from the chapter called Destinies, and it's about cotton. In February of 1920, the cotton market collapsed. The newspapers clocked the local price falling from $1 to 15 or 20 cents a pound. Nobody saw it coming. The day the crash came, the New York Times ran a feature story about the brand new wealth in cotton country. The reporter wrote a funny scene about almost being run over by 14 black drivers in 14 new cars. That issue of the paper landed on doorsteps, and a few hours later, much of the wealth had vanished. The next week brought nothing but bad news. India reported a huge crop. Rumors spread about the stockpiles of raw cotton in England, putting a halt to all imports. The statement out of Cairo warned all Egyptian farmers who rented land that an apocalypse was coming for them, and that held true for renters around the world. Owning the land and holding enough equity to borrow money might buy a farmer an extra year or two. The reasons for the collapse appear complex in the detangling, but start with simple fear. High prices push cotton farmers to plant more cotton, and people who normally plant corn to plant cotton, and people who've never even seen a plow or a mule to try and plant cotton too. This happened in Sunflower County and the Delta and all over the South, from Texas to South Carolina, and in India and Egypt and Brazil. The warehouses in Manchester filled with raw cotton. That meant abnormally high carryover. The Yazoo City newspaper figured that there was enough unspun cotton in the world to last for the next 2 years. The price kept falling. Membership in the Klan rose dramatically. Buried violence is a perennial bulb that is fertilized by fear and watered by insecurity. The dominant white culture instinctively turns to force in defense of resources. The specific problems might have changed over the centuries, but the instinctive response did not. October brought a New York Times headline that said, "Cotton drops again on Liverpool news." Larger fundamental problems pulled the price down too. Scientists around the world looked for ways to replace cotton with synthetics. The price of 150 denier cotton filament yarn was $6 a pound in 1920. 2 years later, that price would be $2.80, and a little more than a decade later, the price would be 55 cents. The cotton textile industry, which was the reason Sunflower County land held any value at all, was dying. In 1919, the American cotton crop set a record with a value of $2.1 billion. In 1920, the value fell to $940 million. Bad news kept coming. A year later, a government research facility did a series of tests and released shocking and devastating news. The fertile soil of the Delta was losing its nutrients. The short harvest of 1922 brought even more ruin. That was the last crop a lot of farmers made. On January 2nd, 1923, a Tuesday, the Wilson Banking Company took Section 2 from J.W. Riddell. 11 days later, a few miles to the west, Gloria Dickerson's mother was born in a sharecropper's house. Her mother, Lavinia Slaughter, lived next door to her father-in-law, who had made enough money during the cotton boom to rent his own land and try to climb out of poverty. But the cotton bust destroyed all those plans, and he ended up sharecropping again. The great Mississippi Delta cotton boom lasted 20 years. The suffering and killing and decay that would follow for the next century were the price of 3 great years and a dozen good ones. These 2 decades also mark the peak of the lost cause mythology. Consider when all these Confederate statues went up around the state. Consider the history of cotton in the Delta. The land clearing finished around 1900. The price of cotton collapsed for good in 1923. A decade had passed since the cotton market had collapsed. It was 1930. In DuPont's research facility, tucked into a bend of Brandywine Creek in Delaware, researchers invented synthetic rubber. The company had grown into an international juggernaut in the century since the Bryant family had been briefly connected to their rising star by marriage. The laboratory, named Purity Hall, buzzed with scientists hired away from the nation's top universities. In late April, not long after neoprene had been discovered, a scientist named Julian Hill worked with a new machine called a molecular steel and formed polyester with previously unseen strength and elasticity. He'd made the first synthetic fiber. The Mississippi Delta didn't know it yet, but it was about to lose its importance to the bankers and manufacturers who had bent its culture to their return on investment needs. In January 1931, Roy Bryant was born in Tallahatchie County. That same month, the financial structure of the Delta collapsed outright. Banks had no money to lend. Farmers planted some food crops for the first time in memory so people didn't starve. The cotton grew well, finally, but the price fell to 5 cents a pound, which didn't even cover the cost. It was the largest cotton crop ever grown in the United States, as falling prices forced farmers into a doom loop. All the banks in Indianola failed. The Illinois Central began to shut down lines. The next year, the economy of the Delta got worse. Cotton prices stayed low. Almost 40,000 farms went into foreclosure. Across the state, 115 banks had failed in just 2 years. The Federal Farm Board asked farmers to plow up every third row of cotton. Nearly all growers refused. On one day in 1932, a quarter of all the land in the state was sold for delinquent tax bills. Historian John Otto wrote, "In many ways, 1932 was the darkest year since agricultural prices collapsed in 1920. For 12 years, bottomland planters, farmers, and tenants endured poor prices, droughts, floods, and boll weevils. They kept hoping that prices would eventually improve so they could relive the prosperity of the World War I era. But in 1932, their hopes were finally dashed." That fall, Franklin Roosevelt ran for president and talked about controlling commodity prices by limiting the amount planted. He won the election easily. On the day of his inauguration in March, which was the rock bottom of the Delta cotton famine, farmers made plans to plant another enormous cotton crop, despite a carryover of 12.5 million bales. The researchers at the DuPont laboratory kept working on synthetics. The 5 years it took for those scientists to advance from that first fiber to the first nylon were the last 5 years Eula Morgan and her boys lived in the hills. They'd made it to the Delta finally, at the exact moment King Cotton died.